straight back to that.
All right, y'all. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank y'all so much for coming in. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Megan Church tonight. Most of y'all, some of y'all were here last time when she came. Thank you for coming back again. So I'm gonna read her little bio to you, and then she's gonna take it away. Megan Church is the author of The Last Carolina Girl and The Girls We Sent Away. If you have not read The Last Carolina Girl, you need to. She writes to tell grounded stories that explore the complexity of human nature. Her historical fiction chronicles the plight and fight of unheard voices of the past. After receiving a BA in English from Indiana University, Megan built a career as a storyteller and freelance writer for brands, blogs, and organizations. A Midwesterner by birth, she now lives in North Carolina with her high school sweetheart, 3 children, and a plethora of books. So let's please welcome Megan.
Thank you. And to those of you who were here last time and still came back for this one, thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm glad I didn't scare you away. But we had such a good conversation last time around. And it was also a different format because you'd read the book, and so we could talk about, the characters, the spoilers, the characters we hated, the ones we loved. So we can't do that this time, but I would like to just talk a little bit about The Last Carolina Girl for those of you who haven't read it yet, and then also introduce you to this new story that just released yesterday. So yay! It's still very, very new. And if you don't know who I am, that is completely fine, because truly, I am a girl from a cornfield. I grew up in northern Indiana, about a half hour, 45 minutes south of South Bend, which is where Notre Dame is. Everybody's heard of that. Nobody has heard of the cornfield that I grew up in. And truly, my parents bought 1 acre of land off my grandparents and built a house on that farmland. And so we were, in the summer, we were either surrounded by corn or soybeans, depending on the crop rotation. And while I didn't love that setting as a child because it was full of a lot of boredom, I have grown to appreciate it now because I know that quiet childhood really helped foster my creativity and imagination. I don't really want to give my older brother credit, but the fact that I was the annoying little pesky sister that he didn't want to hang out with, I think also helped me with that imagination. And while growing up, I always wanted to be a writer. My 2nd grade teacher saved some worksheets from when we were in her class, and when we graduated high school, she sent them to us. And we didn't know that she had done that. And so we graduate, we get these packets, and in that packet was like an about me, survey that we had filled out. And on that, it asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said a writer. And I didn't even remember having that desire at that age. But I always enjoyed writing in different forms. I like to say that I first became a professional writer when I was in elementary school, and I opened a greeting card company out of my bedroom. I would take construction paper and write awful poems and illustrate them and fold them up, and I even had, it was branded with a logo and everything, and they were called Mega Card. And my dad was my best customer. He way overpaid for these things. But it was just proof of how much I always enjoyed writing. Now, I was not a reader. I did love book fairs, but because I loved the idea of books, I loved to hold it, smell it, look at it, set it on the bookshelf as a decoration. But I was a slower reader, and I was a good student, and I think maybe that was part of what hindered my reading as a hobby, was because I spent so much time on schoolwork and homework that the last thing I wanted to do was sit down and read more. So it wasn't until I was in high school, I'd already figured out that in college I was going to study writing of some sort, and I was getting my hair cut, and my stylist asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said a writer, and she said, then you must love to read. And that was the moment that it finally clicked for me, that to be a writer, I needed to also be a reader. And that was when I became an avid reader. Now, I entered college as a journalism major because I had taken mass media courses in high school, and I had also worked on my yearbook. We had an amazing advisor who gave us a lot of freedom to really make that book our own. And I was the copy editor our senior year, and so I had so much fun writing headlines and leads and just being silly. And that was when I thought journalism is what I want to do. Plus, it seemed more practical. So I'm sitting in a journalism class, and our professor returns an assignment and says, some of you think that this is creative writing, and it's not. And I said, then I'm in the wrong class, because creative is what I want. I want to be able to use my imagination. I care less about the who, what, when, where, why, and how of journalism. I want to be able to really create the story from scratch. So I changed my major to English with a concentration in creative writing. And that's what I graduated with. Now, when I graduated, I thought, well, this is the moment. I sit down, I write the great American novel, and I am off with my life as a published author. But seeing as how my debut released just last year, I'm sure you can guess that was not the trajectory for me. Because when I graduated college, I had a marriage and a mortgage, and every month we'd get these pesky little things in the mail called bills that really demanded to be paid. And so I needed a day job. So all young and idealistic and full of words, I went to work at an advertising agency. Now, South Bend, Indiana, where I was living at the time, is right next door to the RV capital of the United States. It is the town where the most RVs and RV-related products and appliances are made. So a lot of our clients at that advertising agency were somehow involved in the RV world. So here I was, fresh out of college, all idealistic, sitting in a cubicle with no access to a window or direct sunlight, and I am writing advertising, marketing, and public relations copy for things like RV toilets. And I really began to question my life choices. And my manager, who was also a writing mentor of mine, he asked me at my one-year review, how's it going? And I said, I am miserable. And he said, okay, why don't you become a freelance writer? We will be your first client. And then you have the freedom to take on whatever clients you want. Thankfully, I have a very supportive and encouraging husband who also happened to have the benefits in the family. So I was able to make that change, and I've been a freelance writer ever since. So I still do marketing, public relations, content creation, that sort of writing for clients as well. But on the side, I was still continuing to work on my fiction because that's really where my passion was. Now in college, we studied short story. I fell in love with flash fiction, which is telling a story in like 1,000 words or less. But I really wanted to get to the point of writing a novel, but it's a much different beast to write a novel and have character, story, and setting all pulled together for that amount of time. So I had a lot to learn about story structure, but I didn't fully realize that yet. So I have written 2 practice novels that will never see the light of day, no matter how much my mother begs me. One of them, the first one, I believe I wrote that it was the early 2000s. I did what's called National Novel Writing Month, which for the month of November, writers can challenge themselves to write 50,000 words in 1 month. And the idea is you have to silence the inner critic and you just have to sit down and get the work done. Their tagline is no plot, no problem. So I was like, that's great, because I am not a plotter. I am a pantser, just sit down, whatever's in my mind is what I'm writing that day. And let me tell you, I did learn a lot doing that. At the end of the month, I had 52,000 words that I printed out, along with my certificate of completion, and I put them in my desk drawer where they have never seen the light of day since, because what I learned was no plot was an extremely big problem. And so I continued to try to learn and grow as a writer, but then I also have 3 kids, and they were a little bit of an interruption in the process. But after they reached a more sustainable age where they were a little bit less demanding, I sat down and wrote my second practice novel, which I continued to work on for a few years. I got to the point where I hired an editor and worked through a few rounds of revisions with her. I learned a lot. And so I decided that I thought the manuscript was as good as I could get it, so I was going to try to get an agent. And so I queried a number of agents, and as I was waiting for their reply, another idea popped into my head, a different book. But I resisted it at first because it was set in a historical timeline. Everything I had written until then was contemporary and modern. To be honest with you, that's typically my preferred, as a reader, my preferred timeline is modern. And to be honest, it's also easier to write contemporary and modern because you can look out the window and figure things out, right? You know the dress, the hairstyles, the language, all of that kind of stuff. When you're talking a historical context, you have to look up minute details like indoor plumbing, what families would have one car, two car in this time period. When was Wonder Bread invented? When did sliced bread first come about? That was actually a fact that I had to look into for the last Carolina Girl. And it was all of those nuggets. See, I love to research. I am an information junkie. I just want more, more, more. But I was very intimidated by the fact that I would need to get everything right if I decided to write historical fiction. But this idea was in the back of my mind, it was becoming more forefront, and I couldn't let it go. And the reason for that is because I had a personal connection to that story. But as I let that character play around a little bit more and show me who she was, I decided that that manuscript that I had queried a few agents about, that I needed to pull that I didn't want to pursue that because this idea had more ability than what the first one did. Because that other manuscript had a major flaw that I couldn't reconcile. And that flaw, it was very character driven, it was first person perspective, but the main character was boring. And if the author thinks she is boring, what reader is ever going to want to read that? So I pulled that manuscript and I began work on what would become The Last Carolina Girl. So The Last Carolina Girl is set in 1935. It starts at Holden Beach, and it is following Leah, who was growing up wild and free in her idyllic North Carolina coastal setting. When unfortunately tragedy strikes, and she's orphaned, and she is sent away from the only home that she has ever known. She goes to Matthews, North Carolina, where I currently live, and she is placed with a family who seems quite upstanding, according to outward appearances at least. But the longer she's there, the more she realizes that those appearances are nothing more than a facade. And lurking behind that facade are deep, dark secrets that threaten her very future. Because all of this is set in the time frame of eugenics and forced sterilization. So Leah's story is one of autonomy and belonging and found family and a fight for her future when everybody else is against her. So as I finished up The Last Carolina Girl and I began querying agents, now I should specify that Last Carolina Girl, I began researching that in, I believe it was about 2015, okay? And what sparked me, the personal connection that I had to that, was that I had a great aunt who had passed away at the age of 92. She was a woman I knew well. We spent holidays and family gatherings together. And after she passed away, we learned that she had been sterilized by the state of Indiana when she was around 12 years old. Now, again, we knew her so well, and we couldn't understand why this had happened to her. The state had actually deemed her feeble-minded, and they used that as reason to sterilize her. So Aunt Virginia, she was one of the sweetest, kindest, gentlest, most loving and caring people I've ever met. And there was nothing about her that gave us any impression that she was feeble-minded or incapable of living a full and complete adult life, because that's exactly what she did. She loved to bake and cook and garden and play cards and laugh, and she read her Bible daily. And there was just nothing, we could not understand how that decision could be made for her. So I turned to the internet and I started Googling, trying to make sense of what was this practice that happened in our history, and how was this even possible that someone like Aunt Virginia could be subjected to it. So after a while, I stopped putting the idea off and I sat down to start researching. And I opened up a search browser, and I thought as the story was coming together, I thought it would be set in Indiana. I had just recently moved to North Carolina. I was born and bred and raised in Indiana. It was where my Aunt Virginia had also lived her entire life, and it was the state that sterilized her. But my very first search result was it was an NPR article about North Carolina making reparations to the victims of sterilization within the state. And within that article, I came to learn that North Carolina is second for all sterilizations across the entire United States. California had the most, North Carolina had the second most. And it's estimated between 60 and 70,000 people were sterilized throughout the entire country. And in North Carolina alone, it's thought to be around 7,000. And then the article went on to say that Mecklenburg County, where I had just moved to a few months prior, had the highest rate of sterilization within the entire state of North Carolina, 3 times the rate of any other county. And so that was when I decided that the setting needed to be here in North Carolina. And honestly, I did myself a huge favor with that because I love Indiana. I love my friends and family there, but you can only describe a cornfield so many times. And when I decided to set the story here, nature was able to become so much a part of that book, really almost a character in and of itself, really one of Leah's only friends throughout the entire story. And I mean, the state is beautiful, right? Like, I don't need to tell you that, you know that, but from the ocean to the mountains and the Piedmont in between, like really, I don't know, who here grew up in North Carolina? Okay, let me tell you what winter in Indiana is like, all right? Where I was from, we were very close to Lake Michigan. So winter was not just cold and snow. Winter was a gray blanket that just settled in from November and didn't lift until about April. So when we moved here and it was warm and it was sunny, I began to realize it wasn't the snow I disliked so much. It was the gray clouds, really. But when I got the Last Carolina Girl to the place where I felt it was ready to begin trying to seek an agent again, I had worked for years on this, gone through multiple revisions myself, worked with beta readers, worked with my writing mentor back from the advertising agency, and when I sent it out, then I needed to start work on another project, and at that point I already had that next idea. And that's what became The Girls We Sent Away. So The Girls We Sent Away is set in Charlotte. It begins in 1964. And it is the story of Lorraine, who is growing up. She is just the girl next door who seems to have it all. She has the boyfriend, the good grades. She's on track to become her high school's first female valedictorian. And she has a secret dream to become an astronaut. Until she finds herself pregnant out of wedlock, and she is sent away to a maternity home to hide what her parents feel is her secret shame. Now, when she goes to the home, she's told that this is going to be a place where she can figure out her future. And it's a place that will help her with that future. But the longer she's there, the more she comes to realize that their version of the future might not match hers. And it's the question of whether this teen girl in the mid-1960s has the ability to choose the future that she wants. And it is set at the intersection of the space race and the baby scoop era. It's an emotionally charged story that explores autonomy and belonging and a quest for agency when the illusions of life as we know it fall away. Now, readers always like to ask, where did the inspiration come from? Well, with Last Carolina Girl, I had that spark because of my aunt, because of what she had experienced. Even though The Last Carolina Girl is not my aunt's story, Last Carolina Girl is completely fictional. But it was just the fact that had happened to my aunt that sparked the story idea. With The Girls We Sent Away, I can identify 4 major sparks that really ignited to create the flame that became the book. And the first one happened in a 1980s video store. I was there with my dad one Saturday afternoon, and we were picking out some weekend entertainment when he saw somebody he knew and he said hello to her, and I didn't know her, which was a little unusual in our small town. Typically, whoever my parents knew, I had at least met at some point in my life, but I didn't recognize her. So after she left, I asked my dad who she was, and he said that they went to school together. And I said, so you graduated together? And he said, no. And I said, well, why not? And he said, because back then if a girl got pregnant in school, she had to drop out. I don't remember anything else from that day. I don't remember what movies we got, nothing. But that snippet of a conversation stuck with me. And then it attached to another spark. In 2017, I watched The Handmaid's Tale. The series is based on Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel. And as the final credits of the final episode of the first season began to roll, I was sitting on my couch at about 2 in the morning attempting to process what I had just watched. My husband was in bed, couldn't talk to him, nobody else was up, so I turned to the internet and I started reading reviewers' reactions to the series. And one comment said, if you don't think this can happen today, you need to learn about the baby scoop era. I said, okay. So that was all I needed to lose myself in more search results. And what I came to learn was that the baby scoop era is defined as 1945 to 1973, when an estimated 4 million unwed pregnant women were sent to maternity homes, which could result in coerced or forced surrender of their children. By the 1960s, more than 200 homes for unmarried pregnant women existed within 44 states. Some are operated by the Salvation Army, Florence Crittenden, or other religious denominations or organizations. Now, at first, these were places of help. The Florence Crittenden homes, their mission was to keep mother and child together. And even after leaving the home, they would often continue to provide for the mother and the child, giving money and food and clothing to support them. But after the Second World War ended, things began to shift. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, there were soldiers coming home from the war with sexually transmitted diseases, which led to higher infertility rates. So we have couples who are desiring children who are incapable of having them for themselves. And then we have a higher rate of teen pregnancy, in part because of access to privacy that previous generations did not have. Think the backseat of cars, for instance. And so suddenly, we had a potential supply of babies for the demand from the infertile couples. And that's when some of these maternity homes began to take notes and began to realize that perhaps they should shift their focus from keeping mother and baby together to instead fulfilling that demand from these other couples. Now, not all homes operated in the same way. Not every home is representative of what Lorraine's story is in The Girls Who Got Away. Some homes did continue to offer care and support, but others would treat the girls in their charge with harshness. The girls were often told to keep secrets. When they would arrive, they would sometimes be told to only use their first names or to make up a name. Don't talk about their hometowns. Don't give away any identifiers, because when your time here is done, you are to act like nothing ever happened. Don't try to find each other. Everything is supposed to be kept quiet. Some of these homes did not allow the father, the family, or friends to visit during the girls' stay there. Some read and censored their mail. And some of these homes even hired the girls out to the community to work as maids and cooks and servants during their time there. And then they would keep those earnings for themselves instead of giving it to the girls. And many informed these girls that adoption was the only solution. Some went so far as to pressure, manipulate, coerce, and lie to these girls to force them to sign over their rights. Now, through my research, I listened to a lot of women's stories who had this experience. And while this seems very astonishing to the modern reader, some of these women shared that they didn't even realize that what they were doing with their boyfriends was what would lead to pregnancy, because they were so naive and ill-informed about what sex was. Because this was in an era when sex ed was not taught in school. Any sort of book on the topic in the library was kept behind a lock, and there was no access to birth control either. And again, I read and heard how this moment in their lives forever impacted them. When many of these women left the maternity homes, they were told to not talk about it, to hide what happened, get on with their life and forget about it. And studies have shown that these women could experience higher rates of alcohol abuse, drug addiction, multiple marriages, and countless jobs because of the trauma and the shame that they carried with them for the rest of their lives. Now, I'm a mother of 3, and my body has experienced the physical and emotional changes that are part of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. I watched as my stomach stretched, and then deflated, not as much as I'd like, but whatever. And I remember the feeling of breast engorgement and hormonal changes. There's a lot about motherhood, biology, emotions, and attachment that I do not understand on a scientific level. But one thing is very clear. There is no going back to normal after an experience like that. And for the life of me, I cannot imagine what these women, some still girls by society standards, experienced when they were told to forget the feelings, the hormones, the emotions, the physical changes, and just go on with life, get back to normal, and act like this didn't happen. And some of them had to do that without the babies that they very much desired. Now, before this book even hit shelves, women began sharing their stories with me of their aunts, their cousins, their friends, sisters, even their mothers who had some of these experiences. But never the men, never the uncles, the brothers, the fathers. And that's where the third spark comes in. In 2019, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the movie landing. And I had already begun developing this book. Now, my youngest daughter was 7 at the time and an astronaut hopeful. She has wanted to be an astronaut since she was 3 years old. And she was so excited about this 50th anniversary of the celebration. And she was reading, she's a nerd like me, so she was reading all the information and she's telling me all about all of these people who made Apollo 11 possible. And I just looked at her, so hopeful, so full of potential, perhaps a trailblazer like Lorraine, who ever since looking through her father's telescope has dreamt of being an astronaut. And the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't help but think that as the space race took shape, and as we blasted rockets out of our atmosphere as a giant step for man imprinted into moon dust, hundreds of thousands of miles away from planet Earth, how many women lay tucked away in one of those maternity homes, lost, alone, ashamed, and uncertain? So that was the inspiration for setting this novel at the intersection of the space race and the baby scoop era, because I just couldn't stop thinking about those who could aim for the stars while others remained grounded by society's rules and chastised by its judgment. Now, the fourth spark inspired the prologue and became a symbol that runs throughout the book. And it came because I moved out of that Indiana cornfield and I moved here to North Carolina. In 2015, my husband and I were done with snow. We had had 2 consecutive winters of over 100 inches of snow. One night, yes, it's awful. It's awful because life doesn't stop. You just, the roads are passable is what they can, not drive, passable. You just continue on with life. It's awful. And one night in February 2015, we were at an outdoor ATM and we put our card into the machine and the machine froze. And that was the moment we looked at each other and said, why do we live in a place where this is possible? By July, we were living here in North Carolina and we have not looked back. So we decided at that point we were taking our family on an adventure. We packed up our 3 kids, our golden retriever, our very overweight geriatric cat, and we moved here and into a neighborhood with a swimming pool. It is a future that creates a deep sense of community and the opportunity for a lot of conversation and gossip as well. And apparently some of you have this understanding for yourselves. And that inspired the neighborhood setting of The Girls We Sent Away. Now the story is told from a third-person perspective. In my mind, it's never stated within the book, but in my mind, the narrator is almost the neighborhood itself. And while it's primarily in the mindset of Lorraine, that third-person omniscient perspective gives us the ability to dip in and out of various people's perspectives throughout the book. And the pool was what inspired the prologue for that book. See, one day I was sitting at our neighborhood pool, and the safety break had just ended, and the lifeguard was up in the sand, and she was watching the deep end. And at that moment, a little girl around 2 or 3 got just a tad too deep and began to struggle. And thankfully, the lifeguard spotted her and rescued her, and everything was fine. But that girl's struggle was so quiet. And it reminded me of a year or 2 before that. I was at a friend's backyard pool, and a little girl was in the middle, and it looked like she was dancing. She would go sink down to the bottom and push off with her toes, and her arms were out like this, almost flapping like slow wings. And she would come up and she would take a breath and she would go back under. And she was so calm and peaceful, except for her eyes. And I stood there watching her, trying to figure out, is she playing or is she dancing? What is happening? And thankfully, my friend realized what was happening and jumped in and rescued her because she was drowning right in front of me and I did not even recognize it. And those 2 moments were when I realized the drowning doesn't look like you think it should. And that became the opening line of The Girls We Sent Away. Because the more I began to think about the story, drowning seemed like the perfect metaphor for what a girl like Lorraine must have experienced. So I'd like to take just a couple minutes to read you that prologue. Drowning doesn't look like you think it should. And according to little Barbara Ann Walters, it doesn't feel like you think it should either. It's not an obvious splashing and yelling and causing a commotion. The young girl wished it was, because then maybe someone would have noticed her. Instead, the Sunnymead pool members went on with their conversation, sunbathing, and lifeguard ogling as the 4-year-old bounced from pool bottom to surface and back again. It was the summer of 1964 in a typical mid-century suburban neighborhood, where a portion of North Carolina's green canopy had been cleared in the name of development. Whether from an aerial perspective or a street view, Sunnymead offered plenty of symmetry, order, comfort. Houses perfectly balanced, trees precisely pruned, lawns meticulously manicured, inhabitants properly trimmed, for the most part, and a cautionary tale, if not. On that particular late summer afternoon, as Barbara Ann struggled in the middle of the pool, the Sunnymead sisters gossiped in their gaggle. This group of middle-aged women, who had spent years bonding over plasticware parties, rummage sales, and ambrosia salad, spent weekday afternoons chatting in the shade, careful to steer clear of both the water and the sun. All donned the unspoken uniform of oversized sunglasses, hats, and moons, creating an orderly display of belonging. On the other side of the pool, the adolescent boys, all in similar swim trunks, all with the same crew cut, all hell-bent on testing boundaries and ignoring the teenage lifeguards, jumped, pushed, and roughhoused into the deep end, too absorbed in their antics to see anything else, including the girl who was about to give up. Surrounded by a community of people, Barbara Ann sank to the bottom and bobbed back to the water's surface, with only enough time to gasp for a small bit of air before sinking again. Her toes pointed like a ballerina's, arched and reaching before pushing off the pool bottom as soon as they touched it. In the midst of silent panic, she almost looked as graceful as the dancer on her music box. Her arms flapped like wings, fighting to fly her out of her predicament, as her eyes pleaded for help in a way her voice had no time to. As she would rise a few inches above the waterline, the child tried to search for her father. He lounged only a few feet from the water's edge, but her plight prevented her from finding him, focusing on him, calling to him, the man who was supposed to save her. In truth, the father didn't know what was happening with his daughter. He was too busy watching the bathing suit strap hang off the young lifeguard's shoulder. No one else noticed anything out of the ordinary. No one noticed her bobbing, sinking, struggling, drowning in plain sight. Now, in my author's note at the end, I talk about the proverbial rose-colored glasses that we have a tendency to wear, especially when we look back on our history. But when we take them off, what we often find shapes us, and it should. And my hope is that this story and others like it can start a conversation to bring awareness to the women who spent months alone and ashamed inside of one of these maternity homes. And then we're told to get back to normal and move on with life as if nothing ever happened. Now, storytelling has been a part of my life since the earliest cornfield days. And I want to thank all of you for helping make this journey possible, because without readers, Leah and Lorraine's stories would remain locked away in my imagination, but I'm so happy to share them with you. Again, thank you so much for having me here today. If you want to stay up to date with me, you can go to my website, meganchurch.com, and join my email list. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads at mchurchwriter. But in closing, I hope you get swept away in Lorraine's story. And even though it is a work of fiction, I hope that it offers an empathetic look at what women in our society have faced. May we all have the eyes to see those who are drowning and the wherewithal to extend life preservers with grace and mercy. Thank you. Do we want to do Q&A? Yeah. All right. Yeah. Anybody have questions for me?
Without spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers, sorry. Yeah.
Like your process,
You're asking about the process?
like your writing process.
Uh-huh.
Do you have like storyboards that I've seen in movies and that sort of thing? Like across your wall with all the characters and that sort of thing?
No.
Okay.
But that's just not my process. So truly, I live inside my head.
Okay.
And so, like I said, I am not a plotter. I have gotten better at figuring out the story, so the rough draft isn't quite so rough. But figuring out the story to me is character development, really. You know, typically an idea is sparked because of some historical nugget that is just blowing my mind. And then I keep researching and as I'm researching, this character starts to introduce herself to me. And then I just spend a lot of time trying to figure out who she is. What is her need? What is her desire? What is her want? What can't she get? What does she think she wants, but actually she needs this instead? And the more I play around with that, then the story starts falling into place. So there is, I use a program called Scrivener, which is an amazing writing program. And you can have like character descriptions in there. You can keep research in there. You can compile all of this. And you can also use note cards. It's all an electronic thing. And so that's the most like visual sort of thing that I'll do is if I can get to the point. My agent keeps, I have a work in progress at the moment that my agent's like, you need to write a full synopsis. And I'm like, I don't work that way.
Yeah.
Like I'm not at that point. I have to have the full draft done before I know all of those bits and pieces. So I'm not an outliner is basically what I'm saying. I just hold it here in my head and hope I can get it out in a timely manner. Any other questions?
So last time you were here, you were this, and you got your working progress or that's
I can give you a tiny sneak peek. It is still very early. So with the girls we sent away, I got my book deal with Source Books in mid 2021, and this was already done. It was, I still, and I should say, I still worked through revisions, but the story was together. After I worked on revisions of The Last Carolina Girl with my editor, I was then able to apply some of those same things to this one, and so I was continuing to work on it, but I knew what the story was. I'm in a different place right now, but the story is still very much in development. But the overview at the moment is it's following a 1950s housewife whose sanity is being called into question after the birth of her second child. Okay, all right. Yeah. Do you want to message my editor and say, hey, we need this story? So it's really her cookie cutter existence is beginning to crumble. She has what seems to be the American dream, so why isn't she happy? And this is in a time when women could just be given the blanket diagnosis of hysteria when they had real things happening like postpartum depression or even things like lupus that were studied on male bodies but not female. And so, you know, instead of really treating what's actually going on, here's a little happy pill for you, or here's electroshock therapy, or here's even lobotomy. So that is where I am at the moment. If you just want to plug, that would be awesome. You had a question too.
I have a question. So I watched an interview recently with Allison Martin, another author, for the People Who Speak. And she said, if you ever get a chance to talk to an author, ask them what's a weirdest topic that they know a whole lot about because of the research that they do? So,
Okay,
what's like the weirdest thing that you would try out at like a party and have people with or?
What would I try at a party? Okay. I'm hesitating because I know this is streaming at the moment. Because there was something I had to research for this book. That was one of those, like, I hope nobody goes through my search history. Because basically it was, you know, women in this predicament of an unwanted pregnancy at the time would take extreme measures sometimes, right? And one of these things was a Lysol douche, where they would use Lysol in ways Lysol should not be used. And it would a lot of times lead to contact burn and things like that. And so it was, you know, the rabbit hole of research just leads you into, you know, bizarre areas. So as I'm reading these articles and I'm fascinated, but also like, what am I reading, right? No, I would not maybe bring that up as, you know, a cocktail party or something of the sort. You know, and I've also been asked about, because, you know, I don't talk a lot about the space aspect of the book in my talk, and part of that is simply because the space aspect is her dream, but it's not the reality that she's living at the moment. But again, just having that space obsessed daughter in my house, and also just being fascinated with the concept as well. Like there were even things, you know, like Tang, for instance. So last night at my launch party, we called it astronaut punch, and it was Tang. But what I learned, I always thought Tang was invented by astronaut or by NASA, or at least for NASA, but it was invented before. It was like the mid to late 50s. And NASA used it on its mission when John Glenn first orbited outside of the atmosphere. And then it has been on, I think they said nearly every mission since then. So there's just like weird, you know, random things like that.
I should ask them about me making this name.
Yes.
What about Lorraine's name?
Lorraine, oh, good question. Okay. So Lorraine, okay, Leah's name means a burden or sorrow. And I chose that for the last Berlinic Girl because I knew that was how she was perceived. It was not the reality of who she actually was, but it was how she was perceived. With Lorraine, to be honest with you, I don't know the meaning, which is bizarre because meaning to my husband and I when picking names is very important. Okay. Our son is named Jonas in part because of The Giver. And I read that book in my children's lit class in college, and I fell in love with that name. And it also means gift of God, and so we really like that meaning. My middle child, her name is Kenna Grace. Kenna means beautiful, so beautiful Grace is her name. And then we came to Adeline, my third one. And we realized this. I'm getting to the question, but I'm doing it in a roundabout way because it will make sense. But we realized when we were trying to figure out a name for Adeline that we had come up with a J and a K name, and my husband and I are both M's. So we thought, can we get an L name to fit in there, right? JKLM. And then we also realized the kids had 5-letter names, so you know we're trying to, but we wanted good meaning too. Lydia was a choice, but the meaning of Lydia is a woman from Lydia, and so we were like, well, we just want a little bit more meaning to it. So then we went with Adeline, which means serene and peaceful, because I was hoping for a serene and peaceful girl. It was not the case. She had the worst colic of any of them, but anyway. So what's interesting is we have Leah and Lorraine, and the main character in my work in progress is Lulu. And I have not done this intentionally, but I think it's my subconscious still trying to find that perfect L name that we did not accomplish for number 3. But with Lorraine, I don't know what the meaning is. The Lorraine, I knew of the Lorraine as I was growing up. And I always kind of liked the name, but then Paul Simon has a song, Darling Lorraine. And as I was listening to the song, I thought I could see this woman being described in the song as Lorraine later in life. And that was how I ended up choosing that name. Yes.
What is your favorite writer? What is your favorite writer and why?
Yes. So my all-time favorite writer is an oldie but a goodie, Wallace Stegner. His book, Crossing the Safety, is one of my favorites. It's very quiet and literary, but it's a story of friendship over decades. And I'll be honest, the first time I picked it up, I had to put it down. I wasn't getting into it, but now it is a book that I will reread and I don't do that with many books at all. My favorite current author, still living, is Elizabeth Strout. She has written a Lucy Barton series and Alice Kittredge, and the way she can so simply tell a story so deeply in character is what I really admire. But if I can share some of my favorite recent books. Has anybody read Shark Heart? Have you read Shark Heart?
Yes.
Okay, so it's bizarre, okay, because it has magical realism to it, because the man in this couple of this book is turning into a great white shark. So it is like this totally, it's as if this is ordinary and normal, right? And it is so bizarre, but it is very beautiful. And that is, I have it written down, Emily Habit is the author of that. Another one of my favorites from last year was Remarkably Bright Creatures. Has anybody read Remarkably Bright Creatures? I love it, and again, I have a thing for animals. I wanted to be a marine biologist if I wasn't going to be a writer. Because in Remarkably Bright Creatures, there's an octopus who we actually get his perspective from time to time. And it's just, I fell in love with the octopus, but it's just, it is a story of a woman later in life trying to figure out, her husband and her son are both gone, and she's just trying to figure out what the next stage of life looks like for her. At the same time that there's a young adult male trying to figure out what his life is going to look like as well. And so then we have this octopus that is narrating from time to time too. So. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much for coming.
Did I hear a little bit?
Oh, yes.
Hold on.
I'll do this on the screen.
Hold on. Bring up the logo. Thanks so much.
Upside down and everything. Okay, so what I figured we would do is, we can line up in the middle, and I've got the books over here. I'll give you book and then you can go over to Megan and she'll find it and you can ask me other questions. Yes. No, we were just gonna do it in here, but if it's a little warm in here, but, yeah, I'm gonna have this one too. Yeah, just a lot.